Hi, and welcome to episode 49 in our Middle Eastern Islamic history series. This episode, we're going to talk about the Caucasian Wars, which are the wars that occurred in the countries surrounding the Caucasus Mountains between 1917 and 1922. So here are the rules for those who may be unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we may be discussing today. That said, I'm a lay person who takes a vested interest in this, and I will endeavor to provide you a secular presentation, trying not to bias in favor of any of the participants, which of course, when talking about anything in the Caucasus, for those who are familiar, is a very difficult thing to do. But let's be respectful of the difficulty of the topic, but in the same time, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat in real time and will respond to your questions as we go through the discussion. What I like to say is that these presentations, these classes are a 101 and a 201. A 101 being that if you don't know anything, I'll try to catch you up as best as I can. And a 201 meaning that if you understand the basics, there are going to be nuggets of information that you weren't privy to, and hopefully I can provide even more clarity on the situation. What I like to do is I have a 2-hour hard stop. So at 9 p.m. Eastern time, you know that I will not put up any new slides. We'll continue any discussion if we're having a discussion or people want to ask questions, but no new information will be provided. We'll just put whatever slides are left into next week's presentation, and we can just continue it from there. That way, you know that I respect your time, you respect my time, and we can enjoy learning together. When I put dates below a person, those are their years of service in whatever role they happen to have, be it prime minister, general, chief of staff. Whatever those dates are, those are the years of service. It is not their birth or death date. That said, of course, it could very well be their death date in a number of cases. And this 49th, as well as all of the previous entries in my Middle Eastern Islamic history series, as well as all the other series that we put here, can be watched later on our website, Omnicarta, or on our YouTube. Please subscribe to our YouTube if you enjoy what you see. And again, we appreciate donations for the maintenance of this. So I want to sort of orient us a little bit into what the Caucasus is and where we are. So this is really the intersection between three major empires, right? You have the Russian Empire in the north, the Turkish Empire or Ottoman Empire historically in the west, and Iran or the Persian Empire in the south. And so most of our presentation today will be talking about the South Caucasus, which is the area to the south of those mountains, dominated today by three large countries, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And on the right side, you can see that the distinctions that we have today were not the distinctions that existed at the time historically. For those of you who can read Cyrillic, or because this was part of the Russian Empire at this time, you can see that they were divided into what were called gubernia, and these gubernia were based on the largest city in the region. So, for example, in orange is the Kutayskaya gubernia, meaning the gubernia based in the city of Kutaisi. For example, on the far side in the purple, you have Bakinskaya gubernia, right? The gubernia based in the city of Baku. So in many cases, the names of the cities, the names of the places, the names of these regions keep changing over and over again. So when I refer to place names, I will try to be consistent and use the names that are used today. So for example, I will not call it Alexandropol, I will call it Gyumri in order to avoid a lot of confusion. And there's another thing, and I'll point it out when we get there, is that the development of the Azerbaijani ethnicity as a coherent concept develops during this period. Prior to this, people would call the Azerbaijanis Tatars, they'd call them Turks, they'd call them a number of different things that didn't specify their ethnic character. And so for the sake of clarity, I'm going to call them Azerbaijanis even when that would be anachronistic. The Caucasus is one of the most linguistically and ethnically diverse places on the planet, and I just want to show that a little bit on the map here. If we look at Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, these are distinctly large populations in the Caucasus compared to, especially if you look north of the mountains, where you have Ossetians, for example, Kabardians, Circassians, Dagestanis, Kumyks, all kinds of different nationalities. the irony that we're going to see is that the more diverse North actually holds together better than the less diverse South, because of the North's inability to rally behind any singular ethnic group, whereas the South, we will see a lot more divergence here. I also wanted to point out that many of these languages are not mutually intelligible with one another, so they would use Russian or some other language in order to communicate more effectively. And this region, we've talked about in several of the past episodes, has been fought over quite extensively. So we see, and in fact, if you remember, the Kurchi were slaves of Armenian and Georgian heritage brought as soldiers in the Safavid Empire. Again, fighting over this territory. This particular event, right, we talk about the Siege of Shamakhi in episode 30. In episode 30. And in that episode, we discussed how this was an attack by Sunni Lezgians on the Shiite population of the city. And so even within the Muslim community, we have divides between the various ethnic groups. Even during the Zan period, which is towards the end of the 18th century, if you look to the northwest of the Persian Empire, most of the South Caucasus is within a Persian sphere of influence, but you can also see that these are blocked apart, that these are a number of sort of cross-hatched puzzle pieces. And what this indicates is that during this period, these were independent or quasi-independent states that were part of the Persian world, meaning that they were vassal states to varying degrees. In fact, one of these vassal states that survives even until the mid 18th century are the Khachen and the 5 Melikdams, which roughly correspond to the area of Nagorno-Karabakh. We're going to talk a little bit more about that region as we go through this. You can see it in sort of circled on the map here. And this map shows as labels the different khanates, these semi-independent kingdoms in the south. Most of these khanates are run by an Azerbaijani. For example, you can see Pana Ali Khan Javanshir, who was one of these khans. He was the khan, I believe, of Karabakh. And these khans unified these sort of city-state-like constructions prior to the conquest by the Russians. We also see that Georgians were in the process of unification as well. But it was similar to a Game of Thrones environment where the different leaders of these different khanates would create alliances with each other. And some of these khanates were within the Russian sphere, some of these were in the Persian sphere, but you have to understand that the relations between these states are usually far more important than their relations to the more powerful sovereign until we get really to the Russian expansion into the region, which solidifies around the beginning of the 19th century. And this is part of what is called the Great Game, right? The Great Game is a contest between Britain and the Russians in order to control more territory, create a larger empire and colonies, the British Empire, of course, being based on the Indian subcontinent, and the Russians expanding from their center at St. Petersburg. As you can see from the map, all of the Caucasus, both the North Caucasus and the South Caucasus, comes within Russian control in the early part of the 19th century. And that happens through a number of wars of conquest. In fact, we have many cases of Russians of Georgian heritage, like Pavel Tsitsianov, who you can see there, commanding these Russian soldiers in their attacks on the various khanates of the south. The khanates of the south are having support primarily from the Persians, who see it as their duty to protect their vassal states, and from the British, who are providing assistance to the Persians in their modernization. As we discussed in several of the previous episodes, the British assistance to the Persians was, of course, conditional and was not designed to create a Persian empire that would be able to compete effectively with the European states that were modernizing much more quickly. And as a result, Russia was able to make several advances into the Caucasus and abolish these khanates. The Russian presence in the Khanates was thoroughly detested. Alexei Yermolov is probably the most famous of the Russian leaders who really created this negative aura around Russian control and occupation. He famously said, as I quote here, "I desire that the terror of my name shall guard our frontiers more potently than the chains or fortresses," meaning that he would repress the citizens. You had hangings of women and children who were, generally speaking, innocent of whatever crime they had been accused of and known to be such by the population. You had extermination campaigns, such as occurred during the Caucasian Wars, where Cossacks were sent into the Auls. The Auls are these mountain villages that existed among a number of the different Caucasian peoples. And the Cossacks would go into these Auls and force the local population either to flee or to die on those hillsides. And you can see from the length of time that these wars went on, how difficult of a process it was. In many cases, it can be likened to the struggle that the Americans had when they were moving further west of the Mississippi River and encountering a number of indigenous tribes, some of them who were willing to fight quite strenuously for their pieces of land that they had held historically. The Russian victory over the Caucasians was in no small part due to the creation of the Georgian military road, which extended all the way from the north through the Caucasus Mountains and into modern-day Georgia. This is a road that is actually still used between Georgia and Russia for day-to-day trade now. Of course, it's paved as opposed to what it was then. This period of the Caucasian War also inspires the legend of Imam Shamil. Shamil is a Dagestani, which is a Muslim ethnicity, Turkic-speaking. They speak a Caucasian language. But he managed to get a large confederation of North Caucasians behind him by establishing a constitution that would confederate all of the different North Caucasian tribes, especially a significant number of Circassians behind him. He was eventually defeated by the Russians, but his reputation is so well deserved that he is still seen by Russians today as an important figure in the Caucasus. You can sort of equate him in the American sense to a Sitting Bull, or where he has this kind of gravitas. But eventually, by 1829, the Russians had solidified their gains. They had fought a war against the Ottomans to take control of the southwest portion of Georgia, and they had solidified their gains against the Persians by 1829. And part of the final process of the Caucasian Wars was what was known as the Circassian Genocide, in which roughly 700,000 Circassians were expelled from the territory of what is today Russia, especially from their homeland of Adygea. And most of them were resettled within the Ottoman Empire. Another 800,000 of them were killed outright, and roughly 20% of the original population remained in the region as a repressed minority. When the Circassians came to the Ottoman Empire, they were often recruited as military shock troops. And so the Circassians were disproportionately represented in the Ottoman military from 1867 onward, especially during the First World War. Now, we discussed in episode 27 that the Russians and the Ottoman Empire had basically been at nonstop war since the 1580s, by the time 1877 and 1878 rolls around. So this is probably the 10th in the series of Russo-Turkish wars, but this is the most disastrous for the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire loses even Turkish majority territory to the Russians. This is the taking of the city of Ardahan, the city of Kars, and the city of Batum, which is part of today's Georgia. And during the war, there were numerous massacres perpetrated against the minority groups. There were massacres against Christians perpetrated by Muslims, and massacres by Muslims perpetrated against Christians. These kinds of massacres and the situation following the war leads to general dissatisfaction with the Armenian community, and we discussed this more in depth in episode 43. But it's important to remember that as a result of these struggles, one of the groups that formed were what were called the Dashnatsutyun, or the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, And the Dashnaks were a group that was founded in Russia in 1890 and expanded into the Ottoman Empire due to the increasing dissatisfaction that Armenians within the Ottoman Empire had with the aggressive tendencies of Kurdish and Circassian militants operating in the region, and the inequalities of the Ottoman justice system that they were subject to. In fact, the Dashnaks coordinated a number of what were called fidai, or militant terrorist groups that would operate in the eastern part of Anatolia in order to deal with what was on the Muslim side also militant terrorist groups made by Kurds and Circassians. Armenians, therefore, who were affiliated with especially the Dashnaks, were heavily involved in the Balkan Wars. We can already see Ozanian and Nzhdeh. We're going to see both of these people showing up in the Caucasian Wars, taking part in the First Balkan War on the Bulgarian side. They had their own Armenian contingents that fought alongside the Bulgarians in their stunning victories over the Ottoman Empire in 1912. Now, we talked about the Middle Eastern theaters of World War I, and we did that in episodes 45 and 46, but we're going to do a quick reprise of the Caucasus campaign because of its relevance to our current situation. So, the Caucasus campaign was effectively that we had Russians who were expanding into the Ottoman Empire. They were led by Nikolay Chkheidze. And it wasn't just that there were Russians fighting here. There were also Armenian volunteers, about 150,000 Armenian volunteers coming from the Armenian territories within the Ottoman Empire, especially those in the region of Yerevan. And those Armenian volunteers were controlled by a number of Russian generals of Armenian descent, and they were involved in the wars that the Russians fought in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire had a huge difficulty in confronting the forces on this eastern flank for several reasons. The first is that the Russians were technologically significantly more advanced than the Ottomans were. The Ottomans had difficulty modernizing to the same degree that the Russians had. But probably a more glaring issue, and you can see it on the map on the right-hand side, is that the Ottoman rail network did not cover anywhere in the eastern part of Anatolia. That entire large blue circle is completely devoid of any rail lines of any size. In fact, the small blue circle is the city of Ankara, the current capital of Turkey. And that was as far east as the railroad went anywhere in the Anatolian plateau. The Russians, by contrast, had railroads that went all the way up to their border that was established in 1878, allowing them to resupply much more effectively. Not realizing this, Enver Pasha, who is one of the three Ottoman leaders at this time, there's what's called the Committee of Union and Progress Triumvirate, the CUP Triumvirate, and Enver Ismail Pasha is one of these three. He orders an attack on the Russian position at Sarıkamış. Now, what he was expecting to do was to defeat the Russian position easily, force the Russians to go reeling back. All of his German military advisors, because there were numerous German military advisors like Otto von Feldmann here, this is because the Germans and the Ottomans were both central powers in World War I, that the Germans would advise against this kind of attack, especially since the Ottoman forces were fewer in number, less well-equipped, and the Russian forces were entrenched. Enver Ismail, one to never take advice from others, went right into the fray and was decisively defeated at Sarıkamış. He almost lost his life in the battle, and he argued that the reason that they lost was because of Armenian backstabbing. Armenians were drafted into the Ottoman army, despite all of the craziness that had gone on in the Anatolian Peninsula. But even though they had been drafted, they were still accused of being disloyal without any evidence provided. Now, there's a question here of why weren't there Ottoman railroads in Anatolia? They simply didn't build them. It is harder to build in those kinds of areas, especially as you get closer to the border. It tends to get a little bit more mountainous. But no, the reason that the Ottoman Empire didn't build railroads is because most of the railroads that were built in the Ottoman Empire were built with German sponsorship, and the Germans saw no benefit to creating a railroad into the Caucasus. They only discovered petroleum in Baku, very close to World War I. And what was more important to them was creating a railroad to India, which is why you have the Baghdad-Berlin railway. If we go back to the map, you can see just below the blue circle is a black line that extends all the way to Baghdad, which was German financed. A great question, actually. All right. So as the Russians advanced, they encountered Armenian resistance to the Ottoman forces, especially because the Armenian genocide, as I discussed in episodes 43 and 44, had started, especially in the city of Van. In what is known as the defense of Van, Dashnak Aram Manukyan coordinated a number of Dashnaks and Hunchaks who were in the city to push all the Turks out. There was an ethnic cleansing of the Turks in the city. And following that, the city held out under siege from Turkish officers led by Cevdet Bey, who was the governor general under the Ottoman forces. Yudenich brought his relief forces in time to recover Van, and the Armenians within the city reached out and welcomed the Russians coming. As the Russians moved further west throughout Anatolia, they would use Armenians as their city administrators because they knew the region well enough. And the Armenians trusted the Russians to a degree that they did not trust any of the other nationalities operating in the theater, certainly not the Ottomans. By mid-1916, the Russians had pursued the Ottomans all the way to Erzurum, which meant that they were in control of significant amounts of Ottoman territory. Now, they could have moved further. There was no obstacle in their way that was stronger than the Russian military at this point. The difficulty was supply lines. Without the railroads, which was the handicap for the Ottomans, now the Russians were in the same position. And after they took the cities of Erzincan and Sheikh-Alan, there wasn't much further west that they could move without having massive supply trains that they simply just couldn't manage. By the beginning of 1917, these were the territories under the control of the Russians. You can see that sort of yellow area, Pontic Trebizond province, the Erzurum province, and the Khnous province. And then finally Van province. Those were the areas under Russian control from the start of the war. Now, this is not going to be a long discussion on the Russian Civil War, although that is definitely merited, and I hope the members of this group who are more Russian inclined will jump to the challenge. But it's important to note a few things about the Russian Revolution. The first thing is that it occurred in two phases. There was the February Revolution, which removed the Tsar and put in a caretaker government led by Kerensky. This was a government that was made of a number of former Tsarist advisors, and they generally continued World War I, which had been the reason the Tsar had been overthrown in the first place, which led to the second revolution, the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks managed to seize control of St. Petersburg, the capital city of Russia at that time. The next important thing to realize is that the Bolsheviks' primary policy at the time that they took St. Petersburg, and it remained so throughout the war, is that they would be withdrawing the Russian participation from the war. And so all of these Russian gains that had been taken would now be forfeited. Russians began to retreat within the territory of Russia, especially Yudenich, who was the chief general we saw on the Russian side. Yudenich actually becomes one of the leaders of the White Movement, which is the movement against the Bolsheviks within the Russian Civil War context. The Russian Civil War follows directly from the Russian Revolution, and we're going to discuss some of that. But by and large, the revolution stays away from the outermost regions of the empire in its early days, and so we're going to see a lot more push and pull in this region. That said, the Bolsheviks did consider that they would have a part to play, and so they appointed Armenian communist Stepan Shahumyan to be the leader of all of this region. both the territories that the Russians had conquered and those that were part of the Russian Empire in 1914 as a new Soviet, right? Soviet means a workers' collective. So the idea of the Soviet Union is that you would have numerous different Soviets, and these Soviets would all be eventually united in one country. But at first, that was a much bigger goal that they couldn't yet attain. And so each of the Soviets would be established as an independent entity, eventually receiving help from others, and then eventually integration with others. So one of the first things that develops after the February Revolution, but before the October Revolution, is that the mountainous ethnicities end up declaring independence under the Shamil Constitution. Sorry, they end up becoming independent under the Shamil Constitution. They don't declare independence until 1918. But you can see that it's a large number of varied ethnicities that come together in what's known as the Mountainous Republic, or the Republic of the North Caucasus. And what ends up happening is that there's a central committee that comes together, and it represents a number of different ethnicities. They're led by Tapat Chermoyev, who was ethnically Chechen, but they had representatives from numerous different groups. You had Dagestanis, Ossetians, Kumyks, Lezgins, Ingush, all of these different groups within the mountains, and they sent ambassadors to other countries or to deal with other officials. The Mountainous Republic also had a problem in that there were numerous Russian settlers in the region. They were nowhere near the majority. The majority were indigenous tribes people, right? The war against them had ended in 1864, but Russian colonization of the region had not completed, and that's why even today these regions have large sections of non-Russian speaking as their dominant language, non-Russian speaking regions. Now, what ends up happening with this confederation is that it's boxed in by both sides. We're going to see that they have a positive, somewhat positive relationship with the Georgians, although Georgians have issues with the Ossetians, who are part of this coalition. But they also have Russians pressing them on the north. In this case, it's going to be the White Army. And so relations between these groups are very difficult. And in many cases, because of the historic injustices that were perpetrated against the Caucasian peoples, you had attacks by them on the villages of both Cossacks and Russian settlers. You also had the establishment by most of these groups of the official religion being Islam of the Mountainous Republic, making it the first Muslim republic in the world. Now, there were minorities in this coalition that were non-Muslim. Ossetians are mostly Christian. And there were a number of Circassians who were of the Khabze faith, the traditional animistic faith of the Circassian people. Most Circassians are Muslim, some are Khabze. And in many cases, the leaders of this group are more educated than the general population they serve. And you can see that, for example, with Vasangirai Jabagiev, who is Ingush and yet is dressing in Western attire. The same with Ibrahim Bey Haydarov. All right. Now, the southern part of Russia was organized first by what was called Ozakom, or the Committee for the South, for the Transcaucasus. And in Russian, it's also the Russian is up there. But it was usually collapsed to Ozakom, and the territories were divided in this way. From Moscow, an Armenian named Hagop Zavriev was sent to manage the region, and the region was, of course, still at war with the Ottoman Empire. So what had happened after the Russian troops fell out was that the Armenian volunteer units effectively became the defense that this region had against the Ottoman Empire, because, of course, World War I had not ended yet. This was in the middle of 1917. So we had a situation where the Ottoman troops, led by Mohammed Vahid Pasha, were advancing into both Batum and into Kars, those regions in the southwest that are sort of brownish on this map. And Hagop Zavriev was in charge of trying to negotiate a solution with the Ottomans. That said, however, the Russians were already negotiating their own solution to the war with the Germans, right? This would eventually become the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. But the Brest-Litovsk Treaty would not come to fruition until March of 1918. So what ends up happening here is that the Ottoman troops keep advancing until Zavriev and his ambassadors managed to get them to sign the Armistice of Erzincan, which took place, of course, in that city, and was a recognition to a certain degree that the Commissariat was somehow a quasi-independent entity, not entirely under the control of Moscow anymore. Now, under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a significant part of the Transcaucasus was ceded to the Ottoman Empire. You can see that in the map there. Now, the Ottomans were not terribly enamored with how little they had received under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They believed that they were entitled to all of the Caucasus, including the Mountain Republic, which you can see there. And accordingly, they did not feel themselves bound to the treaty terms, although they did see it as a place to start negotiation. In fact, the main goal of the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, and it was part of the reason that they committed the Armenian genocide as well as the Greek genocide, Assyrian genocide, and others, is that they believed that there should be a great Turkish nation, a Turanic nation, which should extend to all territories in which Turks were a majority. Now, Azerbaijan was such a region. In fact, Turks imagined creating a link from the Aegean Sea to the Caspian Sea that would hold this large Turkish nation. So naturally, they were going to invade and make that happen. But the Germans, the Ottomans, had only really been allies throughout the war because of their mutual antagonism towards Russia and their mutual fear of Russia. The Ottoman Empire didn't care much about Britain or France. In fact, as we remember, Britain and France had been historic allies to the Ottoman Empire during the Crimean War. And so it didn't make sense from the Ottoman perspective to continue working with the Germans and having Germans advise the Ottoman soldiers. From the German perspective, it also didn't make sense because the Germans didn't see eye to eye with the Ottoman desire to continue to move into the Caucasus. The Germans wanted the oil from Baku, but they didn't really want to expend any military resources in getting it. They would have preferred diplomatic ones. And so the two of them started taking very different avenues. We also see that the removal of the Tsarist power leaves open a vacuum in the Muslim majority regions, both in the mountainous republic and what today is Azerbaijan, and in some western parts of Georgia. So the question was, would the new quasi-regime, the Ozakom and its successors, would they treat Muslims differently than they had historically been treated under Russia, which was quite poor? And they got their answer relatively quickly. Lenin provided permission for Armenians who had been expelled from the region due to the genocide to begin resettling. Around 100,000 Armenians began settling in the Caucasus, which was, in the view of many of the Muslims, deeply insensitive. And additionally, he appointed Stepan Shahumyan, as we've talked about earlier, to run the Baku Commune. And as we're going to see, Shahumyan's leadership style does not seem as favorable to Muslims as they may otherwise want. Accordingly, we begin to see the view of the Muslims shift into a more anti-Bolshevik stance, into an anti-communist stance. But how would that stance be molded? Well, prior to the war, there had been a lot of influence from Persia into the Caucasus region. And in particular, Jamaluddin Afghani, who we've talked about before, was an Islamic modernist and a pan-Islamist, both of those movements working together. And so we should talk a little bit about what those are. Pan-Islamism is the belief that all Muslims should be part of one Muslim majority state. That state should be either guided by religious values, but ostensibly secular, think the United States, for example, or such a state should be directly theocratic. Think Iran as an example. But this state should be an international state, including all Muslims. And in particular, this was strongly felt among Azerbaijanis, Lezgins, and other Caucasus peoples, because by themselves, they were very small groups, but as an international coalition, they could be rather large. So that's one part, that's the pan-Islamism part of their ideology. There's also the Muslim modernist part of their ideology. And Jamaluddin Afghani, similar to Namik Kemal in the Ottoman Empire and Rifat Tahtawi in Egypt, held that there was no contradiction to be found between Islam and modernity. That is to say that Muslims should be able to accept science, should be able to work with science, that they should be able to build industrial technologies. In fact, Jamaluddin Afghani said that the great sin of the Muslim world is that we are not the leaders of modern science and technology, that the West has usurped this role from us. And so by embracing these Muslim values of freedom, tolerance, science, technology, all these kinds of things, as a result, there will be an ascendant Muslim state. So that's Muslim modernism. So these two ideologies, in the case especially of Azerbaijan, but in the Caucasus overall, brought them into a greater alignment with the Ottoman Empire than perhaps other members of the Transcaucasus had been. And this applied with equal fidelity among the Azerbaijanis as with the people of Mountainous Republic. So Enver Ismail Pasha, now with his break from the Germans, decided to create what he called the Army of Islam, or the Army of Islam of the Caucasus. It's known by both names. And this army was recruited both from trained Ottoman soldiers in the Third Army and from troops that were from the Caucasus region, especially Azerbaijanis, but again, also people from Mountainous Republic. The Army of Islam moved through the area of Transcaucasia until reaching the region of Baku in order to bring it into the Ottoman Empire and unify this idea of a Turkish state that goes from the Aegean all the way to the Caspian. So it's important for us to understand where the North Caucasians were. So they're sort of sitting in this weird area between two fires. As you can see from this map, the areas in dark red are those that are under the control of the Reds, the Bolsheviks. The areas that are gray are in control of non-Bolsheviks, be they independent countries like Poland or Lithuania and Finland, or they are areas controlled by whites, like in our case, Denikin, who was a white general and controlled the area just north of the Mountainous Republic. Now, General Denikin engaged in numerous battles with the Mountainous Republic, but the Mountainous Republic responded in kind. Many of the Russian soldiers that have been deployed from the Caucasus, especially if they were from indigenous Caucasus people, were put in Caucasus divisions. In particular, there was what was called the Caucasian Savage Division, which was a division of mostly Circassians, but also a mix of Lezgins and Dagestanis as well. And this group, basically, when the Russian army collapsed, because the Russian Empire collapsed, became part of the Mountainous Republic Army. And they began fighting a defensive war against Denikin. And this war continued for nearly 3 years. The whites finally were able to overpower them in 1920. But in order to run this war campaign, the Chechen leader, Chermoyev, decided to give up power to a Circassian leader, and he would take the military side. The Circassian leader, of course, is Chkheidze Przemysław. Yeah. And he was now trying to hold together the remnants of the Caucasian Savage Division, as well as other soldiers that had been recruited under the terms of the Mountainous Republic Constitution. At the same time that they're trying to hold off the north from taking them over, they are trying to hold off their recruits from slipping to the south. General Yusuf İzzet Pasha was the Ottoman commander of the Army of Islam as it was marching through the South Caucasus. And Yusuf İzzet Pasha was also himself Circassian, meaning that he had a special relationship that he could develop with those of the mountainous republic and really reach out to them as somebody who could say, within the Ottoman Empire, you were accepted. Look at my position. So it was effectively that the mountainous republic was between two fires, that they were losing people to the north through fighting, and they were losing people to the south through enlistment. In order to continue the Russian struggle, and one of the German policies as World War I was finishing was to continue the Russian infighting to prevent the Russians from ever having a place to push back. The Germans provided weapons to the mountainous republic in order to continue its struggle against the whites, especially because the whites, it seemed, were doing relatively well, and that they eventually would have to defeat the Caucasians. So this is a map of the Caucasus advance by the Ottomans. So you have the Erzincan treaty, the Erzincan armistice in the December of 1917, but starting in early 1918, the Ottomans reject the validity of the armistice of Erzincan, and they do this primarily because the Armenian troops that had been left behind, those Armenian volunteer units, were continuing to harass Ottoman positions. Those Armenian units were understandably responding to the fact that the Ottoman Empire had committed a genocide against the Armenians and felt that the Ottoman Empire needed to be put down. That said, the Ottoman Empire didn't take lightly to this, and the Ottoman Empire was much more organized, significantly larger, and more put together than the Armenian coalitions that were arrayed against them. And so the Ottomans were able to push into the Caucasus and able to get all the way to Baku. They did this by avoiding the central areas of Yerevan and Nagorno-Karabakh, but they were able to get all the way to the Caspian by the middle of 1918. During this time, there is a consistent push from the Transcaucasian entity to try and create a new lasting treaty with the Ottomans. The Ottomans, however, refused to negotiate with any entity that was not itself a country. So Nikolay Chkheidze from the Georgian side argued that Ozakom and the Transcaucasian Commissariat that succeeded it should be retired, and the people of the South Caucasus should do what the North Caucasus had done in would do in May of 1918, which is actually declare independence. And they declared independence as the Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic, or TDFR. Now, the TDFR had immense problems because the different entities that composed it didn't necessarily have the same foreign policy. While the Georgians and the Armenians were very antagonistic towards the Ottoman Empire, seeing it as directly threatening their lands, the Azerbaijanis were not as bothered by the invasion of the Ottomans, and in fact saw the Ottomans as their fellow co-religious brothers. Remember the view of pan-Islamism, that the Ottomans and the Azerbaijanis are really one people, and therefore no harm would come to the Azerbaijanis as a result of interactions with the Ottoman Empire. And to show you just how the empire had difficulty coming to consensus about what to negotiate and how, you can see in the picture, this is the Trabzon Peace Conference. Members of the TDFR met with Ottomans in the city of Trabzon, which was an Ottoman-controlled city, to discuss the terms of peace. And the Ottomans quipped if it is the entire population of the Caucasus, it is indeed small. But if this is a negotiating committee, it is far too large. And it was a negotiating committee, but the negotiating committee had to represent the various ethnicities in suitable numbers. Additionally, when they had votes for parliament, you can see the Georgian Mensheviks in red, the Musavat party, which was the dominant Azerbaijani party, and the Dashnaks, the dominant Armenian party, got roughly equal shares of the seats in the parliament. And those 36 other seats were by a number of other parties, most of which represent either Azerbaijanis or Georgians, the Armenians being the smallest members of the three-way coalition, and desperately in need of having the support of the larger Azerbaijani and Georgian populations. Now, one thing in particular that shows how non-responsive the TDFR was, or how slow it was in responding, was the surrender of Kars fortress. Now, Kars, as you can see here, is a city that was in territory that had been taken by the Russian Empire in 1878, but was historically a mostly Turkish city. The fortress, however, had been built and expanded by the Russians, and Chkheidze, who was Georgian, and a number of other non-Armenians told the garrison to surrender rather than fight. The garrison, of course, was maintained by mostly Armenians, and so this created a lot of antagonism between those two sides. Additionally, there was a lot of interethnic conflict between the different parties, and so the TDFR broke apart almost as soon as it had been created. The first entity to break away from the TDFR was Georgia, and they declared independence on the 26th of May, 1919, about a month and a half after the TDFR was officially inaugurated. It had started really in February of 1919, but it was made official in April. Now, the Georgians claimed a significant amount of territory, and you can see what they claimed in the map below. But the Georgians had one ace up their sleeve that the other Caucasians did not have, and that was direct German support. Right, as I said, the Germans and the Ottomans were no longer seeing exactly eye to eye, and the Germans felt that there would be a way to access Azerbaijani petroleum, and that was through the Trans-Caucasian Railroad that they could start in Tbilisi and then take that to Baku and negotiate a settlement from that side of the Trans-Caucasian state. So the Germans form a protectorate in Georgia. They begin to train Georgian military, and they start to build up Georgian defenses. This is led by the German General Kressenstein. The Democratic Republic of Georgia is also unique in that it is a Menshevik state. The Georgian Mensheviks were the dominant party in the parliament, but it was not a one-party state. It had numerous different parties, and there was a lot that Georgians needed to do in order to build the country. They needed to create a number of institutions, schools, sanitation, all these kinds of entities of a modern state. And by and large, with German help, they were progressing. The second group to declare independence was the Musavat party, right? That Azerbaijani party. And they declared independence actually in Tbilisi. You can see the building in Tbilisi where they've declared independence. You can see the plaque from it, and you can see it's written first in Azerbaijani Turkish, then in Georgian language, and then in English. The Azerbaijanis couldn't declare in their desired capital, which was Baku, because Baku was under the control of the Baku Commune. We're going to discuss a little bit about that later. And so their first parliament was held in the city of Ganja. You can see Ganja on the map. It's in that red circle. So the Musavat party is a combination of two different things. It has both that pan-Islamic element and a Muslim modernist element, but it also has a view towards protecting the historic interests of the Azerbaijanis, usually large businessmen, landowners, individuals like this. And so they had a number of laws which improved the status quo, things like all of these Transcaucasian states allowed voting for women, and they also increased the amount of modernization. In fact, the Musavat party actually spoke to Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles. He did not receive them as warmly as perhaps he should have, but they spoke to him on the terms of self-determination, nationalism, and other parts that showed that they were part of the modern political discussion. They were also the ones who chose the name Azerbaijan. Now, this name caused a little bit of consternation. The area of Azerbaijan, the area north of the Aras River, the Aras River forms the boundary between Iran and the former Soviet Union. The use of the term Azerbaijan for the area north of the Aras River was historically not used at all. The name of that territory was either Shirvan, or the southeast Caucasus, or Absheron in reference to the peninsula. But the name Azerbaijan was used for the Iranian region further south. And the Iranian delegation to Azerbaijan wanted it to be extremely clear that from the Azerbaijani government that they were not intending to take the Turkish region of Iran that borders it into the republic. At this point, Musavat made no claim that they were going to do that, but the name was certainly one that got them a lot of consternation, especially since most of the people there didn't call themselves Azerbaijanis at this time. On the western side, the Armenians also were on the verge of declaring independence now that the two largest entities of the Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic had broken away. In particular, this couldn't have come at a worse time because the Turks were invading the historic territory of Yerevan Khanate, which was the territory controlled by the Armenians. You can see the map in the upper left-hand side. However, the Armenians won a massive victory at Sardarabad in 1918, which stopped the Turkish advance, the Ottoman Empire's advance. And this battle occurred less than 10 kilometers away from Echmiadzin, Echmiadzin being the center of religion in the Armenian world, the equivalent of the Holy See in Rome, the Sistine Chapel. The Battle of Sardarabad meant that the Ottoman Empire would have to accept a peace solution where Armenia survived as an entity. And what ended up happening was what was called the Treaty of Batum. And it was called Batum because it was signed in the city of Batumi. And the treaty was incredibly harsh on Armenia. You can see that it is basically a rump state, that area in yellow. And under the treaty, there would be a requirement for Armenia to provide a method by which the Ottomans could get to Azerbaijan and provide it military assistance. So you have a corridor to Azerbaijan, and you also have a corridor to the Nakhchivan region, in particular the city of Julfa. Now, because of the Armenian genocide, you had a significant number of Armenians moving into an increasingly smaller area of the Armenian state, as well as other Armenians from the Caucasus region, right? You have Armenians from Georgia, Armenians from Azerbaijan, who are increasingly feeling under threat or directly attacked because of the interethnic conflict that's beginning. You have cases of Muslims setting fire to Christian homes. You have Christians setting fire to Muslim homes, especially Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Throughout Georgia, which is an area where you had large populations of both. In fact, Armenians, the smallest number of Armenians actually lived in Armenia during the Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic days. More Armenians numerically lived in Georgia and lived in Azerbaijan than lived in the country of Armenia. Armenians tended to live in the larger cities as opposed to being spread out throughout the countries. And Georgia and Azerbaijan had significantly larger populations to start with. One of the things is that because Armenia was so historically so historically divided between the Ottomans in the west and the Persians or Russians in the east. The Armenian language has developed a number of different dialects, and so accommodating all of the different Armenians from different areas of Armenia was particularly challenging. Some of that actually can be seen today with the influx of Armenians from Syria, who are primarily from the western part of the Armenian world, and so speak a different dialect than the Armenians who were born in what is today Armenia. Now, Hovhannes Kachaznuni, who was the Armenian president at this time, had the duty of assembling his country, and he had a number of Armenians, both from Russia and from the United States, come to help him build all the institutions that he would need for government. And his government was composed almost exclusively of Dashnaks, right? He himself was a Dashnak, as were most of his officers. Their job was primarily to secure the independence of Armenia in this increasingly difficult time. Leading the charge to make a larger Armenia was Andranik Ozanian. We've seen Ozanian before. He fought during the First Balkan War on the Bulgarian side, and he has a lot of other military experience during World War I as well. But Ozanian was devoted to taking the region of Zangezur, which you can see on the map on the lower left-hand side highlighted in red. The reason he was interested in Zangezur is because it is an incredibly mountainous and easy to defend region, and it would cut the Azerbaijanis off from Nakhchivan and from the Ottoman Empire. Ozanian brought his special striking division into the territory and began to massacre the Muslim population that lived in Zangezur. Zangezur was roughly 50-50, slightly more Azerbaijani population than Armenian population, but roughly 50-50, and he expelled or murdered all of the Azerbaijani population in that region, making it a solidly Armenian region, an exclusively Armenian region, and he began to build defenses around Zangezur in order to prevent Azerbaijanis taking that territory. So we focused sort of on the Georgian and the Armenian side of the equation, and we discussed a little bit about what was happening in the western part of Azerbaijan. Now we have to turn to the eastern part of Azerbaijan, and as I mentioned, there was the Baku Commune under the rule of Stepan Shahumyan. Now, Stepan Shahumyan was a communist, and but he was willing to make alliances with a number of the other political parties. There were Mensheviks in Baku, and there were SRs, which was another socialist party, socialist revolutionaries. So Shahumyan also, though, realized that his government was not necessarily going to be the most accepted by the local population, especially given the view of pan-Islamism that was there. And so he maintained close relations with the Dashnaks that were based in Baku. Now, one of the things that's sort of hard for people to remember because of the way the populations look now, but Baku had a significant Armenian population at this time, and so there were Dashnaks based in the city of Baku. And so there was a protest in March by the local Azerbaijani population, and Stepan Shahumyan decided to put that protest down. And the way he decided to do it was to call upon the Dashnaks to do it. So now you had this group of Armenians going after this group of Azerbaijanis. And of course, they did not hold back. They considered the Azerbaijanis complicit with the Ottoman genocide, despite the fact that the Azerbaijanis had nothing to do with the Ottoman genocide of the Armenians. And roughly 12,000 Azerbaijanis were killed. You can see in the picture on the lower left-hand side, a consul from Iran visiting the victims that were killed during these what were called March days. It was a 4-day massacre, and it thoroughly incensed the Azerbaijani population, and at the same time gave increasing validity to the Ottomans who were invading from the west, as well as to the Musavat party and their Azerbaijan Democratic Republic that was being set up in Ganja. Knowing that the force that the Dashnaks and the White Russians the Dashnaks would be insufficient to defend the city, there was a silent coup on the 26th of July, which removed Stepan Shahumyan and created a Menshevik power source called the Central Caspian Dictatorship, which basically inherited all of the Baku Commune into its own power. Stepan Shahumyan himself and his 26 commissars had asked for help from other Soviets, but they were more concerned with the Reds closer to Moscow, the now current capital of the the communists. Accordingly, he decided to take a boat to what is today Turkmenistan and try to escape to there. The local leaders in Turkmenistan, to the extent it's unclear, they may have been influenced by the British, they may have been influenced by their own intuition, but they executed the 26 commissars. The committee in Ashgabat executed the commissars between two different train stations because they were taking a train in Turkmenistan. And this murder of the 26 commissars would be remembered during the Soviet period. This is actually a memorial to the 26 commissars that was built in Baku during the Soviet period. In the aughts, the Azerbaijani government completely dismantled it as part of their anti-Armenian campaign. And of course, this was a monument, A, supporting communism, and B, supporting in particular an Armenian who had been the impositor of that communism. Now, the Central Caspian dictatorship expelled Shahumyan and his communists for one main reason. And as I said, it's because they didn't believe that they could defend themselves against the Ottoman Empire with their forces alone. Shahumyan himself was not willing to work with the British, but the Mensheviks who succeeded him were. And so they called upon General Lionel Dunsterville, who was part of the British military based in Iran. If we remember from our previous discussions, the British had maintained a garrison presence in Iran, especially during World War I. And Lionel Dunsterville brought up his so-called Dunster Force, you can see that in the lower right-hand side here, of about 350 men to Baku by ship. I just want to correct something. The March days didn't start because of a large-scale riot. It started because Muslims who were coming to honor somebody were asked to lower their weapons, to give up their arms, and they refused to do so. And so they were opened fire upon, and that started the protest and the riots. You can also see the Kaspi newspaper building set aflame during the March days. In Azerbaijan today, the events of the March days are considered a genocide against the Azerbaijani people. Most external scholars argue that it is a massacre, but does not rise to the point of genocide. Now, we then have what is known as the Battle of Baku, and you can see in red the forces of the Ottoman Empire making their way to Ganja, which has that sort of white semicircle around it, and then making their way further east towards Baku. And the Ottomans are leading their Army of Islam. The Army of Islam actually had to fight at near Nuha against the Red Army, which had managed to penetrate the North Caucasus Republic, but the Army of Islam was able to decisively defeat the Red Army and continue along its way to Baku. The Ottomans then began to shell the Bakuvian defenses, some of those shells hitting the oil derricks that were presumably their goal. In addition to the British, the Dashnaks fought and White Russians, right, who would not have allied with the Commune, but were willing to ally with the Mensheviks, who were now in control of the city, stood to defend it. And the battle raged from the 20th of August until the 14th of September, when the Bakuvians finally surrendered to the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic. Now, in order to maintain peace, the British removed Dunsterville and put in a new general, that was General William Montgomery Thompson. And Thompson's view of peacekeeping was probably very strange by our modern sensitivities. He didn't seem to hold the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic back in any way, as long as the oil was flowing towards British positions. And accordingly, he turned a blind eye when Azerbaijani leaders enacted what was called the September Days. Behbud Khan Javanshir and a number of other individuals from the Musavat party began violent extermination campaign against Armenians living in Baku and the surrounding area. The Armenians at the time estimated that roughly 8,600 Armenians had been killed. Armenians today have revised that number significantly to about 30,000. But regardless, numerous Armenians then began the long departure from the territory of Azerbaijan towards Armenia, if they could. As time moves on and the whites become more of a threat to both Georgia and Azerbaijan, the two countries end up creating an anti-white alliance in order to protect their territory. One thing to point out with Behbud Khan, he was assassinated by an Armenian named Misak Torlakian, as part of Operation Nemesis, which we discussed in episode 44. So finally, the First World War is over. The September Days is usually argued by World War I historians to be the last major massacre of the war on all fronts, but in particular in the Ottoman front. And the Ottomans ended the war about a few weeks before the Germans did, surrendering in October 1918 to Sir Somerset Goldthorpe aboard the HMS Agamemnon, and that led almost immediately to the Allied occupation of Constantinople. But what does it mean for the Caucasus? Well, the Caucasus still had Turkish troops in it, but those troops were quickly removed. And so the first country to really sort of see a difference show up was Georgia. Georgia still had German soldiers in it, but those German soldiers would end their defense of Georgia as a protectorate when Germany surrendered on the 11th of November, 1918. Instead, the British would replace them and turn Georgia into a British protectorate. In late 1918, the Georgians and the Armenians began to contest the region of Lori, which is in the dark red circle. And so there began a small war led by General Drastamat Kanayan, who is often known by his acronym, his nom de guerre, DRO. And DRO led a number of battles to bring Lori into the territory of Armenia. Now, Lori was a majority Armenian region, but had historically been part of the Tiflis guvernia, the Tbilisi Governorate during the Russian period. And so there were a number of fights over who should control it. At the same time, the Georgians were showing a lot more promise. From a military perspective, the Georgian cavalry was absolutely decimated by Dro and his forces, who didn't really experience a single loss, but the British held the two parties to mediate the dispute starting on the 28th of December. So the war took less than a month. And on the 31st of December, an armistice was signed, dividing the region of Lori, 2/3 to Armenia, 1/3 to Georgia. Now, Noé Jordania, the president of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, had a lot on his plate in terms of improving the country, but he actually made, as I said, significant strides, especially in dealing with famine and other food-related issues. He began to start building schools as well. And one of the really interesting things about Noé Jordania is that he was able to create a multi-party pluralistic democracy within Georgia. The largest party, of course, was the Georgian Mensheviks. And as a result, it can be considered that Georgia was a Menshevik country, but unlike the Musavat Party or the Dashnaks, who were basically creating one-party states in Azerbaijan and Armenia, the situation in Georgia was actually multi-party, with Noe Jordania having to consult a coalition of multiple different parties. Now, I have a question here. Did the church speak out against all the killings? Did anybody? Well, certainly there were human rights observers. There were numerous individuals from different agencies, missionaries, Red Cross. A lot of these different groups spoke out against the massacres and the killings. And of course, they had big play internationally as well. Right, but the play that they had internationally was more of how did it paint the political aspirations of one side or the other, right? The March days were publicized as a point of how communism is a horrible human rights atrocity, as opposed to noticing the fact that it was from a governor who was over his head and used one group of militants to smack another down. In terms of religious authorities arguing that their religious penitents shouldn't engage in this kind of violence, there was very little of that in the Caucasus. In many cases, religion served as a unifying rallying point. The Shiite Islam of the Azerbaijanis, the Armenian Apostolic Church of the Armenians, the Georgian Orthodox Church of the Georgians, these generally served as rallying points for those ethnic groups. That said, both Georgia and Azerbaijan had significant minorities of Jews as well, but those Jews were almost never dragged into this conflict between the different Caucasian states. In fact, Jews in the Caucasus have historically had positive treatment from the Christians and Muslims among whom they lived. Eventually, we're going to see Georgia extend into some Turkish-controlled areas. Those are the areas sort of in that Tanish circle, including Batumi. And when that happens, you'll see situations like, for example, this march of the British soldiers in Batumi in 1920 that helped protect that area. During this period, the region of Nakhchivan also declares independence and calls itself the Republic of Aras. Now, Nakhchivan is a region that was ethnically mixed. It was probably about 50% Azerbaijani, about 40% Armenian, and 10% other, mostly Kurds and some Assyrians. There's a question here about why were Jews tolerated. In the case of Georgia, Jews were generally tolerated because they were seen as Georgian as opposed to being Persian, Russian, or Turkish. And so they were seen as part of the Georgian society. They spoke Georgian. If you actually go to Tbilisi, you'll see the synagogue is actually very prominent on Rustaveli Square. Because the Georgian Jews generally were considered a part of Georgia from that sociolinguistic perspective. In Azerbaijan, the Kafkazi Jews, or the Caucasus Jews, or the Mountain Jews, as they're generally called, lived in a number of isolated settlements, and Azerbaijanis saw many more problems with the Christian minorities, especially when it comes to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And so the Jews have generally been defended from the perspective of general religious tolerance for those who don't cause problems. And the modern state of Azerbaijan likes to maintain positive relations both with Israel and with Jews to show its general favorability towards minorities, even though it has an egregious stance towards Armenians. In Armenia, there just wasn't a Jewish population that was that large anyway, so it wasn't really an issue. There's a question of what is meant by a fictional map showing a real location. The map is fictional in that the borders outside of the Republic of Aras never really happened. And it's based on a video game called Weltkrieg. it's basically a video game based on the premise of Germany winning World War I. But it's the only place that I could find that actually shows a map of Aras that is correct. So that's irony for you, because it doesn't match exactly the territory of Nakhchivan today. You can see the slight difference between the shape of the ethnic map and the shape of the republic. Now, Nakhchivan was part of the Yerevan Khanate, and so had been part of the Armenian Republic when Armenia declared independence. However, Jafar Gulu Khan, who you can see on the lower right-hand side, led the Azerbaijani people there to rise up against the Armenians and began to expel them. It wasn't a complete ethnic cleansing in the same way that Zangezur was ethnically cleansed in the other direction, but it was a partial ethnic cleansing, and that would continue through much of the history of Nakhchivan to the present day. Now, you also have the situation of the Kars Republic. The Kars Republic is in the territories that historically were part of the Ottoman Empire, but afterwards became part of Russia in 1878, and then still had a Turkish population. Now, starting in 1918, they began to unify in a number of councils, and so the first Kars Congress, which was the first Turkish Republic, it predated the Musavat in the ADR, but they created the first Turkish Republic, and that republic controlled, at least nominally, the area in that area. There's a question of, were the Aras a people? No, they use the term Aras to refer to Nakhchivan region. They are Azerbaijanis, just like the Azerbaijanis in Baku or in Ganja. It's just what they called their state. So the Kars Republic then had to secure its territory, or at least its claimed territory, against the Georgians and the Armenians, and fought a number of wars. The Georgians invaded at Batumi and were defeated by the Turks of the Kars Republic, but then the British oversaw that fight, and the British themselves were able to defeat the Turks in Batumi. In fact, the British undid the Kars Republic, which itself replaced the Aras Republic in Nakhchivan by the middle of 1919, and the leaders of the Kars Republic were sent to exile in Malta. You can see a picture of them in that picture, a picture of them in the lower left-hand side. From the middle of 1919, when the leadership of the Kars Republic was expelled, until July of 1920, the area remained under British occupation, not ceded to the Georgians or to the Armenians. However, and so it would remain under British occupation through most of 1919 and into 1920. So if we remember, on the Ottoman Empire side, this is the point at which Mustafa Kemal begins to organize in the north of Anatolia, in the region of Samsun, creating his Amasya Circular, which leads to the Turkish resistance movement. So the Kars Republic existed and stopped existing almost immediately before the Turkish Independence War really takes hold. And if you want to learn more about the Turkish Independence War and Mustafa Kemal's struggle to both overthrow the Ottoman Empire and to expel the Greeks who invaded Smyrna at roughly the same time, episodes 47 and 48A cover that. But that just to give you a sense of where we are in the timeline. And in fact, they come up with the Misaki Milli, or the National Pact, towards the beginning of 1920, that they're going to unify a lot of these territories. And if you look towards the east, Batumi and Nakhchivan are considered parts of the National Pact that they wish to bring into their territory, as well as the area around Kars and Ardahan, which was part of the Kars Republic. So We now shift our eyes back to Azerbaijan, but in particular, the area of Azerbaijan that borders Armenia. And this region is called Karabakh, which is Persian for black. Well, Kara is Turkish for black. Bakh is Persian for garden. So Karabakh is black garden. And Karabakh has a low-lying region and a mountainous region that runs through it. That mountainous region, or mountainous Karabakh, has historically had a large Armenian population. And part of the British peacekeeping operation that has started once the Ottomans withdrew from the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic in October of 1918 was that the Armenians who lived in Karabakh, in the mountainous region of Karabakh, would be entitled to religious freedom and civic autonomy, provided that they refused to take political autonomy into their own hands. And so the autonomy that those Armenians were given was codified in what are known as the Karabakh Councils. At the same time, the British general also appointed Khosrov Bey Sultanov, who was an Azerbaijani military officer, to be the governor of Karabakh region. And Sultanov was not excited by the possibility of having a large Armenian contingent in the middle of his territory. And so he began to besiege the major cities of Karabakh, especially the city of Shushi, and it's not here, but the city of Khankendi, modern-day Stepanakert. He was rebuffed from both of those by Armenian defenders. Sorry, there's a question: were women and children spared from the killing? The answer is no. Women and children were killed too. In almost all of these clashes, women and children were killed too. So Khosrov Bey Sultanov, after being repulsed from the major cities in the mountainous Karabakh region, decided to engage instead in a number of massacres at the edge, in the villages along the edge of this territory. Probably the most famous of these villages is Khaybalikend, in which 600 to 700 Armenians were killed. The entire village was erased from the map. There were 5 or 6 other villages that were similarly treated. Sultanov and his Azerbaijani cavalry moved through those towns, destroying a number of Armenian settlements. In order to bring about the peace, the British forced a solution, a ceasefire agreement on Nagorno-Karabakh, this mountainous region. Nagorno in Russian means mountainous, so mountainous Karabakh. So in this mountainous region, of creating Armeno-Muslim administrative councils. There would be 3 Armenians, 3 Azerbaijanis, and they would sit on this council together. Obviously, this is not an accurate depiction of what that council looked like. Those people are far too jovial. But no decision could be made by the council without a 2/3 majority. So that would mean that one member of the opposite ethnicity would have to defect. Khosrov Bey Sultanov, however, was angered by the fact that the council did not serve his interest in unifying the governorate that he had under his control, under complete Azerbaijani control. And so he began another military operation surrounding a number of the cities in Karabakh. But in particular, the Shusha massacre, which was the biggest massacre perpetrated during this struggle, the antecedent was actually Armenian. So in this situation, you had the Varanda militia, which is the militia based in the city of Martuni. And they went into, sorry, I forgot to say, in addition to the Armeno-Muslim administrative councils, Khosrov Bey Sultanov was given 2 garrisons inside of the region in order to maintain peace. And the first one was in Khankendi, modern-day Stepanakert, and the other was in Shushi, at that time Shusha. So these garrisons were full of weapons, and so it allowed the Azerbaijanis to maintain political control, even if they couldn't retain cultural or civic control. So the Varanda militia, based in Martuni, snuck into Shusha, and their goal was to take these weapons, kill the Azerbaijanis who were controlling the outpost, and then somehow assert political independence, seeing how much Khosrow Bey Sultanov was constricting and lessening their power. However, they had drunk a lot the night before. They were in a partying mood, so they were relatively hapless in getting into the fortress. They weren't able to unite with other soldiers that they were going to do a redoubt with. And so in the confusion, they were not able to secure the fortress. There's a picture. There's a question about whether the picture is resembles Bob Dylan by coincidence. No, that is Bob Dylan. I was trying to find a picture of the Verenda militia, and I just found an Armenian newspaper and alcohol. So that would remind me of what happened. Anyway, a similar attack was planned in Stepanakert, at the time, of course, known as Khankendi. And both of these insurrections against the Azerbaijani castle failed. And when in Shusha they realized that the one in Stepanakert had failed and that the Azerbaijanis were still in power, the Azerbaijanis then turned on the entire Armenian quarter of the city. And quarter is sort of a difficult number because it's not a quarter in terms of percentage, it's about half the city. And they massacred the entire Armenian half of the city of Shusha. You can see this is a view of the Armenian church in the background of the city after the massacre in March of 1920. It's estimated that around 500 people were killed. There were numerous others who were maimed, injured, who lost everything. And these Armenians then fled back to Armenia proper. There, some have questioned why it is that Ozanian, who had perfectly defended Zangezur region, didn't extend to Karabakh, which is equally defensible, and maintain a unified republic between a unified control territory between Karabakh and Zangezur. And basically the reason is that Ozanian had heard from the British that the British were going to protect the rights of the Armenians there. And so he took the war to the British in 1919 over what in hindsight looks like it could have been better judgment if his goal was protecting the Armenian population. However, as we pointed out, Ozanian would have massacred the Muslim population if he had come to this territory. And there were Muslims in even the mountainous Karabakh region, despite the mountainous Karabakh region being significantly more Armenian than Azerbaijani. So Azerbaijan was focusing most of its forces towards the west, towards the attacks of Khosrow Bey Sultanov against the highland region of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Khosrow Bey Sultanov was also attacking Zangezur region. Both of these were defeated. Now, at the same time, Denikin and the Whites were not defeated, but a pass-through now existed to get to Baku. And of course, the Soviets needed Baku desperately in the beginning of 1920 in order to continue to prosecute their war against the Whites, continue the civil war, and power their tanks. So as soon as they had that inroad, they took it and they made a straight beeline to Baku. Chicherin was negotiating with Fatali Khan Khoiski, both of these people, the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union. He was the Grand Commissariat, and Fatali Khan Khoiski, the foreign officer of Azerbaijan, trying to negotiate a solution where the Soviets could get the oil. But Chicherin was of the view that all former Russian territories should become part of the Soviet Union. And so the Red Army division, the 11th Red Army advanced into Azerbaijan and arrived in Baku. You can see in this picture a number of Russian communists, but Russian I'm using in the most general sense. Many of them were themselves Caucasians ethnically, like Sergo Orjokhonikhidze, who we're going to see more of. He was ethnically Georgian, but he was one of the ones who masterminded the invasion and Sovietization of Azerbaijan. When Chkheidze was able to justify the invasion through a pretext, and this is a pretext that the Soviet Union would use in many occasions. Sorry. They would instigate a revolt within the city, and the Bolsheviks who were revolting would then request help from the external Soviet Union to help stabilize the situation, and then the Soviet Union would gladly intervene. And so this way, there was already a commissariat in control of Baku by the time the Red Army arrived. The leaders of Musavat ended up leaving the country, many of them going to exile in Turkey or France, and Azerbaijan became a Soviet Socialist Republic. There's a point of how current that tactic sounds. Yes, the Russians are playing out of that playbook in Ukraine today. They played out of that playbook even during the Cold War period. If we talk about Hungary in 1956, it was the same tactic. And it was really patented here in the Caucasus, and it was used to take over Azerbaijan and Sovietize it. Now, with all of this backdrop in the Caucasus comes the Treaty of Sèvres. Now, the Treaty of Sèvres partitions the Ottoman Empire, and the part that really matters to us is that it really expands Armenia further west into the area that used to be controlled by the Kars Republic, and was just given to the Armenians 1 month ago by the British. It was given to them by the British in July of 1920. The Treaty of Sèvres was installed in August of 1920. And so Armenians have no real institutions in Western Armenia. They're just gifted this territory that is literally the entire size of their country. And that leads to a direct confrontation with the Grand National Assembly, which is the government of Mustafa Kemal, which is not yet, because the Republic of Turkey has not been declared yet. It won't be declared until 1923, but it's the army that will eventually create the Republic of Turkey. They refuse to sign the Treaty of Sèvres, and they launch a war against Armenia, starting with several battles in the easternmost territory that Armenia can control, which is Oltu and Galtsvan. But those forces make it very close to Vagashapat and Yerevan, very important cities in Armenia, before on the 18th of November, Hamaza Ohanjanian, the president of the Republic of Armenia, basically has to surrender. And he has to surrender after, in many places of this advance, the Turks had engaged in ethnic cleansing of the Armenians in the territories that they were operating in. Musa Kazım Karabekir, the Turkish general, is estimated to have been responsible for roughly 60,000 Armenian deaths in the region. And the Armenians basically sued for anything that they could get. On the flip side, Azerbaijan, as you can see there, was the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic had been replaced in March in 1920 with the Azerbaijan SSR. So now on their eastern flank is not the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, but the full weight of the Soviet Union. And Sergo Orjonikidze is the representative who then speaks to Ohanjanian and a number of other Dashnaks who are ruling Armenia, saying that they should become part of the Soviet Union or risk invasion from the Soviets. And so the Soviet military begins marching. On the 2nd of December 1920, the Dashnaks resign and allow the Bolsheviks in Armenia, in Yerevan, to take over, and Armenia becomes the Armenian Socialist Republic. 1 day later, the government of the First Republic of Armenia signs the Treaty of Gyumri with Musa Kazım Karabekir. Now, this is sort of a weird thing, because obviously Khatisian, who was the Armenian in question, was signing a document that related to a regime that no longer existed. And so the Treaty of Gyumri has no official binding power. That said, its terms were used for a negotiation between the Soviet Union and the Turks that would take place later, in a few months later. But just because the government in Yerevan was willing to surrender does not mean that all the Armenians were willing to surrender as well. There was resistance from outside of Yerevan, and that was primarily in the southernmost region, in that region of Zangezur, which declared independence under the leadership of Garegin Nzhdeh, as the Republic of Mountainous Armenia. And the Republic of Mountainous Armenia survived for about 3 months, from February till April of 1921. And it's worth speaking a little bit about who Nzhdeh was and what his philosophy was. He was probably the biggest proponent of what's called Serachronism. And Serachronism is the Armenian equivalent, perhaps we can say, to Zionism, the belief that there is an Armenian race that is bound in history, and that race is entitled to a country of its own, to rule its own people. And he believed that the Dashnaks, in surrendering to the Bolsheviks, had done the wrong thing, that the Bolsheviks were not going to respect the Armenians' need to defend themselves, to be their own country, for each people to have their own territory. And you can see the symbol of Serachronism was that Taron, that eagle, ripping apart the snake, representing power over those forces that would divide. However, eventually, even though there was a Dashnak uprising in February of 1921 in Yerevan, the Soviet Union was able to put down both that uprising in Yerevan and to eventually annex the Republic of Mountainous Armenia, with the promise that that area would become part of Armenia SSR. And that's why Armenia still has that province today. When it comes to Georgia, it's a little bit different. So because of the British presence in Georgia, and the Soviet Union being spread incredibly thin in terms of its civil war with the White Army and its war with the Poles. Poland had recently had become an independent country in 1919 as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And Poland was desirous of a number of territories controlled by the Soviet, controlled historically by the Russian Empire. And so there was a war between the Poles and the Soviets. So the Soviet Union was reticent about sending even more soldiers into the Caucasus. They certainly couldn't afford to do that. And so in May of 1920, seeing the British presence as being the bigger obstacle, they had the Georgians sign the Treaty of Moscow, which made Georgia a truly neutral country. The British would be forced to leave the country, and Georgia would be de jure respected by the Soviet Union as an independent nation, free to control its own borders. Now, there was a division as to whether that should be respected going into 1921. There were those like Sergo Orjonikidze, who you can see again below, who believed that Georgia should be incorporated. Of course, he was an ethnic Georgian. Stalin, also an ethnic Georgian. His last name is Jugashvili. Both wanted Georgia to be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Lenin was a little bit more hesitant. And so he refused to give permission to any Soviet invasion of Georgia. However, Orjonikidze could not be deterred. And so he brought a number of forces from now Armenia SSR and brought them to an area called Shalvar at the time, now called Shalmiani, which is a city in Georgia, and a guard post. And he attacked it with his communist forces. When the Georgians came back to fight, he argued that now the communists were being attacked, they had to advance. And so the 11th Army, the same one that had gone through and Sovietized Azerbaijan and Armenia, now marched into Georgia in February of 1921. At the same time, with the Georgians preoccupied with defending Tbilisi from the communists, the Karabekir, the same Turk who had put the Armenians to flight in the Turkish-Armenian War back in October of 1920, now in February of 1921, began to invade territories controlled by Georgia, territories that had historically been Turkish territories like Ardahan, like Kars, but also they made their way to Batum and were able to force the Georgians out of Batum. There weren't that many interactions between the Georgian military and the Turkish military because the Georgians were busy fighting the Soviet Union. But there were Georgians who tried to resist in small distinct ways. By February 25th, however, Nikolay Chkheidze sent this communique to Lenin and Stalin saying the red flag of Soviet power flies over Tiflis, which was accurate. The Soviet Union had conquered the city of Tbilisi. It was called Tiflis at the time, had conquered the city of Tbilisi, and now Georgia was part of the Soviet Union, meaning that the end had now come in early 1921 to the Caucasian experiment of independent self-rule. Now, in order to stop the Turkish invasion that had begun during this Sovietization of Georgia, there was now a negotiation that took place in Moscow between the representatives of Ataturk, his Grand National Assembly, and the representatives of the Soviets. Now, it's worth pointing out that in March of 1921, neither of these two entities was a recognized country by any other major world power. The Soviets did not have full control over the former Russian Empire, and in fact, most Western countries were supporting the whites against the Soviet Union. And of course, the Grand National Assembly was not seen in the international community to represent the former Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which was still standing, was seen to represent that government, the Sultan and his power structure. So what ends up happening is that there is a meeting in March of 1921 between these two groups, and they agree to recognize each other. In exchange for 80 million lira that the Soviets will pay the Turks will guarantee no longer to invade the borders of those territories controlled by the Soviet Union, be those the Armenian, Georgian, or Azerbaijani republics. And in some ways, to be modified a little bit later, the borders will be settled between the two countries, and those borders are eventually completely settled by the Treaty of Kars in October of 1921. Those borders give Georgia Batumi back, but allow Turkey to consolidate its gains. The Grand National Assembly of Turkey to consolidate its gains in Kars, in Ardahan, in Artvin, in these other cities that had historically been part of the Ottoman Empire prior to the war with Russia in 1877 to 1878. For the Soviets, knowing that that Turkey had been pacified meant that they could move their 11th Army out of the Transcaucasus, leave that area lightly defended, and they would be able to prosecute the war against the whites more effectively. Now, what ends up happening when the Soviets take power is that they recognize that it doesn't make sense to leave those three republics, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, as full and intact pieces, because there should be a recognition of the various different states of autonomy that had existed or quasi-existed when the Soviets entered. So the Karabakh councils were recognized by the creation of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. Nakhchivan was attached to Azerbaijan. They petitioned for that, but because they had been physically separated, they were assigned to be an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The Abkhaz in northwestern Georgia had revolted several times against Georgian control over the region, and in fact had been part of the Northern Mountainous Republic. As you can see, many of the elements of the Northern Mountainous Republic were autonomous Soviet socialist republics like Dagestan, like Chechen Ingush, like North Ossetian, like Karabino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia, and Adygea. And so the Abkhaz were also given that autonomy. Ajaria, which is the region where Batumi is, was given autonomy because of the Turkish request in the Treaty of Kars. The Treaty of Kars, of course, gave Batumi to Georgia, but there was a significant Turkish Muslim population as well as a Georgian Muslim population in Batumi, and there was fear from the Muslim side that Georgia, being a Christian country, would discriminate against the Muslim population. Now, the Soviet Union, of course, was a non-religious country, was an atheistic country, but that said, in the Middle East, as we've seen, religion tends to be almost like an ethnicity, more so than a religious confession, although it definitely has that element. So the Muslim identity would still carry even in an atheistic state like the Soviet Union was. So Batumi was protected. Additionally, Turkey could use it as a port for exports. And finally, we didn't talk about South Ossetia, but South Ossetia was particularly difficult for the Georgian government to control during the period of independent Georgia, the Georgian Democratic Republic. There have been several riots by the Ossetians that the Georgian government had put down. And even though the Ossetians were given some minority rights within Georgia, they wanted their own state. And so the Soviets recognized that by giving them an autonomous oblast. On the right-hand side, you can see the level of validity. Now, within the Soviet Union, right, the Soviet Union is supposed to be a union of different Soviets. And so the Soviet Socialist Republics are the entities that form that coalition. And then finally, below them are the autonomous Soviet Socialist Republics, which are subdivisions of the larger Soviet Socialist Republics. And then of less import, because they have less internal authority, are the autonomous oblasts. All right, questions, comments, concerns, curiosities? While you're formulating those, let me tell you a little bit about our organization, History Mostly Ancient Discussions. And so we are, you can imagine us almost like a CNN of different lectures and presentation series. I do Middle Eastern Islamic history. There's a Greco-Roman civilization where we're focusing on the Roman aspect of it. European Union security, powerful women, dead languages, and we have a few short-run series like discussing the Russo-Ukrainian War, our Islam 101 series with a leader from the Islamic Society of North America. And we have older series that you can check out on our YouTube page. So I have a question here. How could Russia, pre-agreement with Germany in 1917, and Turkey commit armies to the Caucasian Wars while fighting World War I? Quite simply, Russia had more than one army, right? So you had Russian forces that were deployed on numerous different fronts. Almost every country in World War I was fighting on more than one front. And one of the things that people often forget is that it was actually a world war. It was fought all over the planet. There were fights in Africa. There were fights in the Pacific Ocean. It was a world war. And so the Russians had these different fronts that they had to fight on. And in fact, you would have communication between allies on either side, be they the Entente powers or the Central powers. They would speak to each other and say, can you open up a front here to divert forces? That was quite often what happened. In fact, the Germans got the Ottomans into the war. We discussed this in episode 45, specifically because the Ottomans could open up another front against the Russians. There's a question of, is the Dead Languages a continuing series? Yes, it is. There is a presentation on the Sumerian language, I believe, on the 14th of September. Don't quote me on the date, but whatever that Saturday is, there is a presentation on Sumerian coming up that day with John Maloney. John Maloney is probably our only accredited expert. He has, I believe, either a master's or a doctorate in linguistics, and so he'll be walking through the language. In particular, Sumerian is really interesting. We don't know what it's related to. It's certainly not related to any other Middle Eastern language, and so I have a comment that says, I think it's September 10th. That could be correct. I don't have the dates in front of me, but you can check it in our meetup group. Again, link is in the description. And yeah, Sumerian, absolutely phenomenal language. And its writing system would eventually be used for Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, and that we discussed previously in his series. Oh, sorry, I think I misread the question. Okay, how could Russia commit armies to fight the Caucasian Wars while fighting World War I? The Caucasian Wars started because of Russia declaring an armistice, right? While Russia was advancing into the Ottoman Empire, right, during 1914, 15, 16, 17, there weren't Caucasian Wars. Those were parts of the Russian Empire. Thank you, Patty. That was that really means a lot, because it's very difficult to weave all of these very disparate people who are doing a lot of different things. The Caucasus is one of the most confusing places in the world. So the fact that you feel like I wove it together and I made it coherent, I really appreciate that. It was very hard to do. And I have a comment, history was written in blood every single page. That's absolutely true. There were attempts to do things diplomatically, but by and large, in the Middle East, and specifically, but in other regions as well, history tends to be written in blood as opposed to by favorable relationships. All right. One other thing that I wanted to point out is that, of course, many of the conflicts that we saw within the Caucasus Wars reemerged as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia became independent countries and were arguing over many of the same issues. Georgia and Armenia fought again over the Lori region. Armenia and Azerbaijan fought over Nagorno-Karabakh. There are issues between Georgia and Azerbaijan. I didn't really touch on them here, about Zaqtala region. And so those were sort of an issue for a few years after independence. So many of the Soviet Union did a great job at freezing this issue, but many of the issues were not resolved, and so they wouldn't be resolved until much later. All right, so thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. All right, goodbye.